Thank you, Mr. President. Last week, the Vice President of the United States was in my state, in Ohio, in the Mahoning Valley, in the Youngstown area, in Northeast Ohio, and he saw what I've been seeing in my state for the last several months, and he heard what I've been hearing from so many Ohioans in the last several months. He went to the Lordstown Auto Assembly plant, which assembles the Chevy Cruze, and he saw what we've been seeing in my state, where manufacturing finally is coming back. From 2000 to 2010, from early 2000 to January 2010, about a 10-year period, the manufacturing sector in this country lost a huge number of jobs, more than 5 million jobs. Now, about the 35 years before that, manufacturing jobs in this country were pretty constant. They were up and down, but in 1997 or 8, we had about the same number of manufacturing jobs in America that we had in 1965. A smaller percent of the workforce, a smaller percent of GDP, perhaps, but roughly the same number of jobs. But from 2000 to January 2010, we lost, some estimates were as high as 1/3 of our manufacturing jobs. We know it was at least 5 million jobs and some 60,000 plant closings in that 10-year period from 2000 to 2010. It's almost impossible to ascribe that, at least in part, to it's certain to be able to ascribe that, at least in part, is trade policy and tax policy. Tax policy that far too often gives manufacturing companies an incentive to shut down and move overseas. If you shut down a plant in Warren, Ohio, or Mansfield, Ohio, or Springfield, Ohio, and move to Wuhan or Xi'an or Shanghai, you can deduct the moving expenses and save on your federal taxes. And it's hard to do anything but ascribe, at least in part, some of the trade agreements we've signed, NAFTA, that the president has pushed through Congress in both parties. And I was just as critical of President Clinton for NAFTA as I was President Bush on CAFTA, and what that's meant, the Central American Free Trade Agreement and the North American Free Trade Agreement. We know what PNTR with China did, where we went from about a not much more than $10 billion trade deficit in 2000 to trade deficits that were 15, 20 billion, I believe $10 to $15 billion a month with China later in the decade. But we know from the policy of tax cuts that went overwhelmingly to the wealthiest Americans that passed in 2001 and 2003, going into 2 wars and not paying for it, a Medicare drug law that in the name of privatization, basically, gave away huge incentives to the drug and insurance companies. All that played into an economic policy that didn't work for the American people. More than 5 million lost manufacturing jobs, 60,000 plant closings between 2000 and 2010. Well, what happened in 2009 and 2010 to finally turn that around is in the House and Senate and the President of the United States rescued the auto industry. We know the kind of job loss we were seeing, and now look what we have. It's not great yet. We're not seeing huge growth in manufacturing, but almost every single month since early 2010 in Ohio and across the country, we're seeing job growth in manufacturing. So far since early 2010, after that 5 million manufacturing job loss from early 2000 to early 2010, more than 5 million manufacturing jobs lost, we've seen 400,000+ net job increase in these 2+ years since then. That's, again, it's too anemic, it's not enough, but it's the direction we need to go. And let me give you a couple of examples, what this has meant and why the auto rescue meant so much to my state and why it's meant so much to the United States of America. The Jeep Wrangler and the Jeep Liberty assembled in Toledo, Ohio. Prior to the auto rescue, these workers assembled these cars, the Wrangler and the Liberty, assembled them with only 50% American-made components. After the auto rescue today, about 75% of the components that go into the Wrangler and go into the Jeep Liberty, assembled in Toledo, Ohio, come from components made in the United States of America. And look at what's happened in Lordstown, Ohio. The engine is made in Defiance, Ohio. The bumper comes from Northwood, Ohio. The transmission comes from Toledo, Ohio. The speaker system comes from Springboro, Ohio. The steel comes from Cleveland and Middletown, Ohio. The aluminum comes from Cleveland, Ohio. The stamping is in Parma, Ohio. And this is put together, all these parts come together in Lordstown, Ohio, near Youngstown, assembled by 5,000 workers on 3 shifts. Almost none of that would have happened without the auto rescue. And you know what else the auto rescue was all about? It didn't just help Chrysler and GM, which had in fact gone into bankruptcy. It also was supported, the auto rescue was supported by Ford and supported by Honda in my state. We have huge Ford and Honda investments in my state. Why would they have supported the auto rescue when the support from the government, the loans from the government, if you will, went to Chrysler and GM, not to Ford and Honda? Because they knew the importance of the supply chain. Because the supply chain for Chrysler and GM had collapsed, as it would have if those 2 companies had gone into bankruptcy and not been restructured and financed so they could come out of bankruptcy. If that had happened, then the supply chain for Ford and Honda also would have partially collapsed. We see that evidence, the evidence of that, and what happened with the tsunami in Japan, where Honda and others had to shut down for a period of time because they couldn't get the supply chain. They couldn't get the supplies, components manufactured that they needed, some of them from Japan. So the point is, Mr. President, that we stepped in with the auto rescue, not just for Chrysler and GM, not just for Honda and Ford. In my state, where 800,000 jobs, it's officially estimated, are affiliated with the auto industry. But it also meant these jobs in Tier 1 suppliers. Tier 1 suppliers, some of them were about to collapse. The rescue of the auto industry also directly helped to rescue some of those Tier 1 suppliers. I've seen those Tier 1 suppliers. Magnum in a suburb of Toledo. I've been there. Johnson Controls, which makes seats. In Warren, Ohio, which makes seats for the Chevy Cruze. I left that one out. All of those Tier 1 suppliers were in trouble. We also knew that the Tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers for the auto industry, making components you might not recognize if you held them in your hands, what they exactly were, but that go into the Chrysler and the Ford and the GM and the Honda. In those Tier 2, 3, 4 supply chain, Tier 2, 3, 4 companies in the auto supply chain were not able to get financing in many times, and we helped through the auto rescue to do that. So the point, Mr. President, is what Vice President Biden saw in Youngstown, in Lordstown, Ohio, what I hear in Dayton and Columbus and Mansfield and Toledo and Rossford and Parma, all over my state. When I hear these workers saying they understand that this auto rescue, where the government invested, these companies are paying these investments back, but the government invested because nobody else would have. It saved all these jobs. It's why manufacturing is beginning to turn around. There are other factors, of course. One of them is the President of the United States is enforcing trade law. We see a new steel mill in Youngstown. In part because the president stood up to the Chinese and forced trade law when the Chinese were gaming the system on something called oil country tubular steel, used in drilling for oil and used in drilling for natural gas. All of that has mattered to this manufacturing job growth. We're not there yet. We need the administration to step up on a real policy for manufacturing, a real strategy. I think they're starting to do that on better tax law, better trade law, better enforcement of trade laws, on assisting manufacturing when we can partner with them, not picking winners and losers, but understanding that manufacturing, to create wealth, you either grow it, you mine it, or you make it. My state does all three very well. We'll continue to with this kind of partnership as we move forward. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.